The bazaar was spread out on a large tract of barren land north of the housing development. Green canvas sheeting tied to bamboo poles offered some respite from the blazing sun, but the sand still whipped through the tents with every gust of wind. The driver stayed with the car, too high up on the servant scale to help carry bags for a Baji who was not his own. Natsia carried the baskets through the maze of stalls while Seema haggled with the vendors to cut the prices on potatoes, garlic, and tomatoes. It wasn't long before both baskets were full, and the weight was almost too much for Natsia to bear. As the midday heat permeated the bazaar, her feet slowed and her head began to ache. A group of Afghani boys in brown kurtas and bare feet trailed after them, begging to help carry the baskets. A particularly persistent boy with dirty blonde hair and hazel eyes, just barely taller than herself, tugged at the basket on her aching shoulder. Baji, Mazdur? He asked, his eyes sparkling. Natsia longed to say yes, but Seema Baji smacked his hand away. We can carry it ourselves. Seema yanked up her dupatta and wiped it over her grim face. Baji, you are not carrying them, the boy said mildly and turned to Natsia. The girl is. That's what she's here for, you imbecile. If I wanted to pay a Mazdur, why would I have brought her along? I will carry them for you for free, Baji. Don't pay me. Are you trying to insult me? Seema narrowed her eyes. No, Baji, he laughed. It's just that the baskets are heavy, and the girl will break her arms by the time you are finished. Let me carry them, and I will save her arms from falling off so she can work for you longer. I won't take any money, I promise. Natsia watched, amused at the exchange. The boy was clearly mocking Baji for bringing a girl as her Mazdur. The bazaar was teeming with people, and nearly all carried their own baskets or employed the services of the Afghani boys. The fact that the Baji did not casually call upon the services of one of the boys to hold her goods as she ambled from stall to stall, throwing her 100 rupee notes on the mangoes the Afghani boys were not allowed to touch, was an obvious outward sign of the Baji's depleted status. That she was one of the many in the posh area of defense who could barely keep up the economic pretense of belonging in the upscale society so far removed from the poverty of Karachi. Fine, Seema said with a dismissive wave. If you want to carry the baskets, go ahead. Natsia, give him everything. Natsia bit her lip to keep from smiling and gratefully handed over the baskets containing the 3 kilo sack of potatoes and 2 kilo bag of turnips. The boy winked at her before pulling the handles of the woven baskets together and slinging them over his shoulder. Now Natsia was able to carry the smaller items that Seema bought from the vendors who roamed the market, hawking their goods in bullhorn voices that carried far over the steady din of barters. Cilantro, mint, and gnarled ginger root fit easily into her shoulder bag. Natsia pulled out the money Amma had given her and chose a handful of items after carefully watching Seema pick through a pile of tomatoes, discarding the rotten ones by tossing them toward the back. She moved on to the guava, holding the golden green fruit up to her nose, sniffing for the sweet pungency that meant soft and ripe, but not so ripe that grubs had made the fruit their home. By the time the grocery shopping was finished, Natsia's head was pounding from the heat and lack of breakfast. She longed to stop at the cold drink stall, but her money was spent and she knew better than to ask Baji. She breathed a sigh of relief when Seema turned toward the front of the bazaar, where the driver waited. The boy followed behind them, doubled over, carrying the baskets like a donkey with satchels tied to both sides. Natsia felt a pang of guilt for carrying the smaller bags, even though they too weighed at least 5 kilos by this time. Seema Baji carried nothing except for her own purse. Do you need any help? Natsia asked. The boy grunted and shook his head, watching his steps through a shag of hair that fell over his eyes. Natsia kept moving, trying to keep the Baji in sight. Seema was nearly at the edge of the bazaar, where the overhead tarp gave way to the scorching sun. Natsia hastened her steps, knowing that Seema would hate having to stand in the open field. As she moved forward, she felt her dupatta slither away from her shoulders. Absently, she reached up to keep it from falling, but was met by a tug that ripped the cloth from her fingers. Shocked that the Afghani boy would be so bold, she turned to glare at him and give him a scolding, but was taken aback by the girl that stood before her. Sarah! She couldn't believe her eyes. What are you doing here? Natsia dropped her sack and flung her arms around the girl. Almost immediately, she felt Sarah stiffen. Natia squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, remembering that they had been friends since the age of 5. She shook that memory and locked it away before releasing Sarah and stepping back with a painted-on smile. Sarah brushed a hand over her camise, absently wiping away any residue from the contact. I'm shopping with my mother. She glanced at the Afghani boy loaded with goods. What are you doing here, Natia? Natia cringed, too conscious of her threadbare clothes, her unwashed hair, and the purple half moons under her eyes. I'm here with... Her voice caught. I'm here with Baji, the woman we live with, she mumbled and looked away. In the distance she saw Seema beckoning to her, her mouth moving. Even the Afghani boy waited for her, and his back seemed to stoop lower and lower to the ground with every passing second. Are you her servant? Sarah finally asked. Natia's smile tightened. Yes, it's working out really well, Sarah. I mean, we have a nice place to live in the best part of the city, and she treats us well and doesn't work us too hard. Natia! Seema was standing at the edge of the tent, waving furiously at her. I have to go, Natia said. The Mazdor was making his way to the car with the baskets. Wait, Sarah called. She stepped forward, but didn't touch Natia. We miss you at school. When the other kids ask about you, we tell them you went back to your village. Her cheeks reddened slightly. We thought maybe you wouldn't want everyone to know that you are a house servant. I'm not just a house servant, Natsia's voice was brittle. I'm a Masi, too. I go door to door and clean the bathrooms and floors for rich people. Sarah's eyes widened. We just thought it would be better if the kids at school thought you went back to Punjab to get married. And what if I want to come see you or Malia in Gizri? Everyone will know then that I am still here and never got married. We didn't want you to be, ashamed about it. Natia! Seema barreled toward her. Come now or you walk. Natia took one last look at her friend before walking away. Well, what are we supposed to say? Sarah shouted behind her. Natia walked swiftly past Seema, leaving just enough distance so the woman couldn't reach out and grab her. She mumbled an apology to the Mem Sahib, who replied with a barrage of insults. Natia tossed the remaining bags into the dicky and glanced back at the bazaar, but Sarah was gone. The Afghani boy closed the trunk and jogged around the car to hold the door open for her. Perhaps it is a good thing that we were interrupted, Natia thought. She could still feel the way Sarah had stiffened and tried to step back when they embraced. She stowed herself in a corner of the back seat and stared out the window as the driver maneuvered the car around the small sand dunes that dotted the makeshift parking lot. The Mazdor had slapped the dicky as the car left, and she turned and waved through the back windows. She wondered if Seema had paid him for carrying the bags. The car stopped short at the gate. Before she could get out, Natia heard the iron bolt slide from the shaft. She wondered if Abu had come to visit. He was usually allowed to leave the construction site on Sundays to spend the day with his family before he had to head back with the Sahib on Monday mornings. Maybe with Shirzad gone, Abu would be allowed to remain at the house as their new gatekeeper. Perhaps if they all lived together, it would almost be like home. Shirzad stood next to the gate. As the car passed by him, he raised his gaze to Natia's and stared with hollow eyes. The skin around his cheeks was bruised, and his lower lip was cut. As soon as the car jerked to a halt, Natia scrambled out and ran to the boy. She moved quickly, knowing she had only a few seconds before Seema would be beside her. The gate remained open for the neighbor's driver to return home after they unloaded the bags, but Shirzad had disappeared behind the mosquito netting of the chowkidar's room. Shirzad! She shifted her weight from one foot to another. Shirzad, are you all right? She waited barely a second before she flung aside the dingy netting, stepped into the shadowy room, and then froze when she came face to face with a woman who could only be Shirzad's mother. The woman's piercing gaze bored through her like a knife. Natia could almost feel her ransacking her thoughts, searching for the proof that it was she who had tricked her son into running away. After only a moment, the woman lifted the corners of her mouth upward into a swarthy smile, revealing deeply stained large teeth. Behind her, Shirzad sat on the charpai, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. Natia gasped as someone grabbed her shoulders from behind. Seema steered Natia out of the room. Go help with the bags. You've no business in here. Natia stumbled back into the sunlight and hurried to the car to gather a few of the bags from the dicky. The neighbor's driver sat languidly behind the wheel, not helping. Natia huffed as she carried the larger basket of vegetables around the front of the house to the side entrance. She stopped to slip off her sandals before depositing the basket on the kitchen floor. She returned for the rest. She heard Isha and Amma call out to her, but she ignored them and hurried back. When she rounded the corner, she spotted Shirzad in the driveway and stumbled, stubbing her toes against the concrete. The skin scraped raw, but Natia didn't feel the pain. Instead, she sucked in her breath sharply as she watched Shirzad dance on his tiptoes while his mother pulled at his earlobe, her elbow jutting skyward, her bangles clanking furiously as she shook him like clothes drying on a line. Natia stepped back, stunned. What was the woman doing? Natia could see the Mem Sahib standing on the other side of Shirzad, her hands on her hips, but it was the high-pitched voice of Shirzad's mother that carried across the yard and drew Natia's mother and her siblings from the veranda to huddle closer where they could see what all the wailing was about. Amma watched in silence, then turned back to the veranda, taking Mateen with her. That woman has been here for hours waiting to return the boy to Baji, she called out to Natia, surprised the child's still standing. What's wrong with her? Why is she so angry? Parveen came here with fire in her belly when she thought Baji had replaced her son with us. She thought we had stolen his duty. When I explained that Baji had room for all of us and that the boy ran away on his own, she went crazy. She couldn't believe that he would bite the hand that feeds him and disobey her so brazenly. Bite the hand that feeds him, Natia said sharply. Shirzad's mother doesn't feed him. He feeds himself by working for everything he gets and doesn't get around here. I warned you to stay out of it, Natia. He is just a child. Half the pain that boy is suffering right now is your fault. For the beating he is getting, you are as much to blame, if not more. You live with that girl. Natia glanced down at Isha at her waist. What would she do if that were her sister out there? Would she be cowering behind the wall as she did now, waiting out the beating for a chance to offer condolences? Or would she have the courage to rush forth and stop the grossly unmatched assault? Finally, the Mem Sahib pulled the boy away from his mother and wrapped a heavy arm around him. She laughed, telling his mother that was enough. Did she mean to kill the poor boy? Natia's mind did somersaults as she realized they were now reversing their roles, so the Baji appeared kinder and more loving, offering relief from the pain his mother had inflicted. The Mem Sahib tousled the boy's shaggy hair, then hugged him close. Shirzad's mother was quiet now, and the Baji's voice lowered to a soft murmur as she clucked inaudibly, soothing him. Sickened, Natia clutched her sister and walked numbly back to their quarters. She'd let Seema take in the rest of the bags. She would not touch them. Natia was acutely aware of Isha's vice-like grip, but did nothing to loosen the little girl's bony fingers. The sound of snoring coming from the sleeping quarters confirmed that Abu had returned home. Instead of collapsing on the adjacent sharp-eye, Natia carefully set the shopping bags on the ground just outside the door so as not to disturb him. She shuffled back to the kitchen and poured herself a tin cup full of water from the metal cooler on the counter. The chilled water was not normally meant for the servants, but Natia didn't care. She was exhausted from the bazaar and knew that it would be at least another hour before the afternoon meal would be ready. She gulped down 3 cups before the Mem Sahib returned with Shirzad. While Seema heated up leftovers in silence, Natia set about the task of cleaning the vegetables for storage. No mention was made of the boy's return or of the party the night before. While Natia stood at the sink rinsing mustard greens and spinach leaves, she snuck glances at Shirzad. If he knew she was watching him, he didn't show it. He knelt down stiffly to set a shallow pan of flour on the floor. Natia stepped aside when he came to the sink to fill a glass with water, and then watched him carry it back to the pan. Slowly he poured the water at intervals and began kneading dough for the afternoon bread. How can he go on as though nothing happened? What kind of boy would not cry after being turned away by his own mother? She watched his body sway back and forth while he pushed and pulled at the stiffening dough. His shoulders scrunched upward as he worked. At the stove, Seema stirred the yellow lentils. Natia realized the scene was the one she'd lived every day since moving into Seema's servant quarters. Nothing had changed, and only the bruises on the boy's face were different. After lunch, Natia lay on the sharp hide.